Welcome to Deeply Rooted, a podcast by Planting Roots, a ministry for military women by military women.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Deeply Rooted podcast. My name's Erin, and I am really excited to be stepping into the podcast coordinator position here at Planting Roots and starting a new series called So There I Was, where I get the opportunity to sit down with some amazing women and hear about their stories. I'm also really excited to welcome everyone watching on YouTube today. If you're just listening to this podcast, then you can't physically see this, but we are here filming this episode today as well, so if you'd like to check that out, go ahead and hit the description of this podcast, and you'll see a link to our YouTube channel, the Planting Roots YouTube channel, and you can subscribe to that channel so you don't miss when we post a new video. So today I am joined by Kristin Goodrich, who you may have heard on the podcast before. KG is the Deputy Director of Planting Roots and has, at one point or another, fallen into pretty much every military category that you can think of. She grew up as a military brat, was an active duty naval officer herself. She then married an Air Force officer, and now she's the mom of a Marine and my mentor, so the mentor of a Coastie. Plus, she has a ton of Army and Space Force friends, so not only is she multi-generational military, but she also covers pretty much every branch. So, KG, welcome to the podcast.
It's so good to be here, and it's really, really fun that we can have this whole military community just across ages and stages and branches and whatnot. And even that shout out, I really appreciate the shout out to the Space Force. For some of you might not realize, we now have a sixth service within the military. It's part of the Department of the Air Force, and they're doing some really cool things. But anyway, it's really fun to get a chance to just chat with you today, Erin, and I'm looking forward to this podcast going forward.
Yeah, I'm really excited as well. So as I mentioned, KG is a very close mentor of mine. She's going to help me share the heart of the title, So There I Was today, and the vision for the series, as well as a bit of my story and what led me to taking this position on the team.
Yeah, so you mentioned real quick before we go any further, the title. Why this title of So There I Was? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I would love to. So the title and my military connection are actually very closely linked. So I'm currently an ensign in the U.S. Coast Guard. I graduated from the academy almost a year ago now, so in the class of 2022. And I'm now assigned to a 270-foot medium endurance cutter in Portsmouth, Virginia, doing drug and migrant interdiction, fisheries enforcement, search and rescue, and even some foreign affairs work the last couple months. And while I was at the academy, I was heavily involved with Officers Christian Fellowship, and one of the leaders of that group, something that he would always say before speaking to a group of cadets, was that fairy tales start with once upon a time, but sea stories start out, so there I was.
I was just going to jump in there. A sea story, I love sea stories because there's when I say there, so there I was, there is an immediate hook. And one of the fun parts of a sea story is that they are things that really happened, but sometimes they sound like they might actually be fairy tales, like they couldn't have really happened. No way could that have happened. But truly those things do happen, and we have some crazy sea stories or military stories within our experiences of military life. So it's a fun way to think about So There I Was, because most of us will pop a mental image into our minds, and it's just a fun way to just start to have engagement and build community, frankly, within the military women that we serve with, that we work with, that we do life with. It's really fun. I'm excited that you picked that as a topic.
Yeah, exactly. So by the time that most of the seniors had heard the same mentor who originally brought this idea up, by the time that the seniors had heard this, it was like the fifth or sixth time that they had heard him say, like, so there I was. So usually when he was telling a story, he'd get to that part and everyone in unison would be like, so there I was. They'd say it all together with him. And it was his way of starting a story where he would share with us something that he went through or experienced in his military journey, like you're talking about, and where God showed up in the midst of it. So simply, the phrase, so there I was, is a way of starting a story. And our stories, they have so much power. I mean, God used the woman at the well, he used her sharing her story to start Jesus' ministry, which is just one example out of the whole Bible full of stories. And they also have so many layers. Our stories have multiple layers, which is something that you taught me about.
Yeah, I love how a really good story lasts over time. Uh, that's why some of the classic fairy tales still we're familiar with, or the parables and some of the Bible stories we might be familiar with, Jonah and the whale, or the feeding of the 5,000. Stories that some of us might be super familiar with. We hear them over and over again, and then over time we start to get extra layers and we start to understand more and more about what the story is sharing. So there's the initial super fun or super interesting or super powerfully moving aspect of a story, but then there's a layer that comes on behind it and behind it and behind it, and that's to me one of the really exciting things. Oftentimes a story might pivot on a really small point, and we might not even realize it. If you've ever watched a good movie and you're like, the bad guy's in the corner, the music has changed, you know that this little thing, like, don't go in there. That little aspect, the story might change. And one of the fun things we've been able to do is have our interaction between you and I also demonstrate layers of stories for me, as well as to sort of share for you that, hey, there might be an aspect of the story you hadn't considered, the story that you are walking out in your own life.
Yeah. I remember one of the first things that we ever talked about. Well, actually, I might as well do this. So there I was. I was sitting in my childhood bedroom in March of 2020. So, the thick of COVID, we had all just been sent home. And during that time, I was in such honestly, a low place in my life. But God, I think, often uses low places as turning points. So now, thankfully, by His grace, I think of it more as a pretty crucial turning point in my life rather than a low point. But I had found myself, like so many other college students, idolizing relationships and trying to find my identity in things that just absolutely did not satisfy. And that same mentor who inspired the idea for this series, he knew that I needed some closer mentorship and guidance. And I don't know exactly how the two of you met, but he gave me your number and said I should give you a call. And literally all I knew about you at the time was that you were like the first female OCF president at the Naval Academy, but that was like the only fact that I knew. But I was desperate. I needed something or someone to help me get back on track. And so at that point in my life, when we first met, I knew God. He had definitely done things in my life to prove that He was real and active, but I hadn't surrendered everything to Him. I hadn't surrendered anything to Him, and I only wanted Him as a quick fix, as the thing that would make the bad things in my life better and make the way for a prosperous future. And one thing that you said in one of our very first interactions is, and this is probably one of the best pieces of advice that I've heard to this day, is that yes, the word is a light unto your feet, but it's not a searchlight unto your feet, which one is fitting because, Coast Guard. But what that means is that, yes, if you walk with God faithfully, He will help you and guide you through whatever you're going through. But most of the time, He's only going to give you what you need for that moment, not the one easy fix for the rest of your life. And that's because He wants you to rely on Him always for your strength and to commit to Him, not just because of what He gives you, but because of the relationship of unconditional love. And so when you talk about layers of God's work, Him revealing different things at different times, He reveals His plan and His timing. And so although we don't see all the pieces to the puzzle all at once, every day through being in the Word, through prayer, and then through being in fellowship with one another like we're talking about and hearing each other's story, we get to see pieces of His plan. And I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, so that comment that again our first sort of meaningful interaction, and there's always in relationship get to know each other period, but that piece that stuck with you on the light into your path, it actually comes from the book of Psalms, Psalm 119 verse 105. It says, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." And so literally, if you think about holding up a lantern, 1880s lantern, there was only a little bit of a circle of light. You could kind of see a little bit of where you had come from, and you could see a little to the left and right, and only a little bit ahead. Don't really know if your path is going to turn right, left, drop off a cliff, up a mountain, into a Garden of Eden kind of experience. We have no idea what's coming next. And boy, do we want that searchlight. We really want to know what's coming ahead, and we want to see what's coming from the left and the right. And frankly, we also want to like understand some of the stuff from looking back over our shoulder.
Yeah. Yeah, very
It's
true.
just so interesting, um, that human nature. So I think for me, I was first when I first like considered that verse in the Bible. It was like, oh, okay, your word is God's word is really foundational. It's going to keep me on a good path, and that's kind of where you were struggling when we first met. Is which path am I going to take, and what about some of the paths I've been on? I'm not sure I like them, so I want to do some course correction. But what I've learned in my own layer of the story over time is how much I want to know. And then as I
Mhm.
feel like I learn more, then I feel like I should know more somehow. But really, God's still, in my 50s, He's
Yeah.
still only giving me a light unto my path.
Mhm.
That is a is a lantern size light unto my path going forward. And so that's really just one of those fun things, that in a layer of the story. So I mentioned that for you, you were trying to figure out which path you were going on, and for me, at that in our these 3 years of having friendship and relationship, one of the paths that I was walking into for the first time was having an adult child get married, and some of your relationship questions and figuring out people and places and timing and plans really kind of rolled into my life as my oldest daughter wound up getting married, and she, like you, had a short engagement, function of schedules, and got married. She's been married for 6 months. You've been married coming up on a year. So you were about 6 months ahead as the adult woman getting married in the military community. Now, Catherine, my oldest, is
Mhm.
not, neither she or her husband are military, but they work in military ministry, and
Mhm.
they just have some, there's a significant amount of overlap from faith to schedules to plans, and so it's been a mutually beneficial kind of experience as I step into my next new path, wanting to be a good mother-in-law, wanting
Mhm.
to have a good relationship with a married daughter, and so anyway, it's really exciting to be able to share this, and for you to step into this podcast role gives us a chance not only to talk about your story and my story, but some other stories as well. So I am part of Planning Roots. I have been for a number of years now, but you're fairly new coming on board, and you've come into this specific role as podcast coordinator. Tell us a little bit more about that and how and why that came to be.
Yeah, and one thing before I answer that question that I think is
Yeah.
really cool is talking about your daughter and where her and her husband work now. That's also a place where I got a very tangible picture of what we're talking about, like the one step at a time, like he reveals things in his timing. Because when I was at Spring Canyon for Rocky Mountain High, when we were hiking up a 14-foot mountain, the day that we summited, we woke up at like 3 a.m. and it was pitch dark. And again, we're summiting that day, so we're getting to the top of the mountain. And when we were walking that morning, all I had was my headlamp and then the people in front of me. And so I'm holding, like, I'm kind of like, I feel the people in front of me, but literally all I have is my one headlamp to the one step in front of me. I cannot see anything else. Like, if I look to the right and left, sure, I can, like, maybe see a little bit, but physically, I can only see one step in front of me. And then we got up to the top of the mountain, and it was like, the sun had finally rose and we got there perfectly in time, and you look back and you're like, holy smokes, like you look and see everything that, I mean, metaphorically God brought you through, but all the things that you stepped over. I realized how steep the mountain was. I don't know how I did it, but I did. Anyway, you look back and you see everything that you didn't see before. And so
Right.
that's exactly what we're talking about here, is that although in the moment when you're going through something, you only see what's right in front of you, God sees the whole picture, and eventually, again, in His timing, will give you bits and pieces to look back and gain trust in Him. And that's like the whole point of walking one step at a time, is that we have to put our trust in God. We don't get a choice because we don't know the whole picture. We have to trust that He sees everything and He knows what's best for us.
What kind of view did you have when you got to the summit with the sunrise? Like, it's not
Perfectly,
just a matter of
perfectly
looking
clear.
backward.
Right. Yeah.
You
It's like
you got a
everything
360.
is exposed. Yeah,
Yeah, it was
exactly.
gorgeous. But you
360.
could see that there were other, it wasn't going to be easy getting back down off the mountain, but you had this moment where you could enjoy like
Yeah.
the literal magnificent handiwork of God as sunrise is hitting the
Hmm.
mountains and just
Yeah.
beautiful and quiet and all the other things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So anyway, to answer your question now, that same time frame that you took me under your wing, I also started to, regain some of the friendships that I had isolated myself from when I was in a relationship. I got back into community and I was finally embracing fellowship, and starting to understand why it's so important. So, starting with you, who really got me rolling on a path to get closer to Christ, I have been extremely blessed to be surrounded by so many incredible, wise women in the military community. And also, somewhere in there, I discovered this deep passion that I have and a real joy that I get from asking questions. Honestly, if someone were to ask me today, like what one of my hobbies is, I literally say asking questions. I really love learning about people, and especially how God has worked through them and in them and through them. And that's something that's brought me closer to God myself, is just hearing from other people how He's worked in their lives. And then I also have found a passion, I think, in my generation specifically, for using social media as a tool, something like using it for good. So around that same time, I started a YouTube channel shortly after we connected, mostly just sharing about my life in the Coast Guard and my faith amidst it. And now my husband and I use a verse in 1 Thessalonians as our motivation for the channel. And the verse is, "Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our lives as well." And that's in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8. And so in this whole chapter, Paul is explaining that he ministered with sincerity and love, not by using flattering words or seeking personal glory, but he loves them enough that he not only wants them to share in the joy of the gospel, but he also wants to do life with them. And so I think if we use social media for good and have boundaries with it, that keep us from idolizing ourselves, it's a way that we can walk through life with each other, even from the distance that military life brings. So, from the people that I met and the passion that I have for those couple of things, God brought me to this role as a way, to share those amazing conversations that I've gotten the opportunity to have with others and expose those who may not be surrounded physically by this community with those same sort of conversations.
Yeah, so it's really cool to see how, again, that God is, if God designed the internet and all of its related social media components as they change and emerge and whatever, He's got His hand involved in that as much as He does in any other traditional sense of other ways we've built community. And we've been building community since the Garden of Eden, since the first two people showed up. That was community. Even the first man with the animals, he had a dog, so there was community.
Yeah.
So since then, we continue to have community, and social media is one of those ways that, again, anything can be misused, but it's one of those cool things to see. And I just want to share a quick story about an Air Force wife, friend of ours. So my husband retired from the Air Force after 23 years of service, and so we're now in that military retired but not fully retired age and stage. One of our friends that we were in Bible study with probably 20 years ago was shared on Facebook the sudden death of her husband, also an Air Force retiree. And unfortunately, some of that had to do with the burn pit damage that he endured during the Gulf War time in Iraq and whatnot. So anyway, I saw that come up, and then their plan was to bury him here in Colorado Springs, where I live. And so I reached out and I said, you're welcome to stay here. And it turned out that she wasn't able to stay at our house that particular weekend that they came in for the funeral, but they were able to stay with some others. And since then, she stayed here. They'll stay here again when the 1-year anniversary of his death happens. She and her whole family. We haven't spoken in 20 years, but that social media gave me the opportunity to see, built on the relationship of a segment of a story. We shared life together, but it was 20 years ago. But this privileged place that we have as military women, whether we are wearing a uniform, whether we're a wife, whether we're a mom or a daughter of military people, or any of the combinations thereof, there's something about this shared experience. So when she shared about what happened at his interment at the military cemetery, I could get it. I get that. We get that. And so that tool of social media has then created another chapter in our story. where she's now stayed. She came for like a respite weekend, just hung out with us, and then we'll go up to visit her in the next month just to help her with one of her school projects that she's got where she works. Anyway, it's just really cool to see these layers of these stories. And again, that social media is a tool and that God is at work in that. But there is something about that one-on-one in person. So we hope this is also a springboard for the opportunity to meet up one-on-one, because you and I have met up one-on-one. It's kind of remarkably, because Coast Guard in Colorado don't generally crisscross a whole lot. But we've seen each other in Washington, here in Colorado, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Connecticut.
Yeah.
Wow, 5 different places in 3 years. But I do think it was because we've had an intentional mindset of doing a hybrid sense of community, both through the virtual things, through technology like phone calls and FaceTime kinds of calls, as well as being in person. So that's kind of exciting. But it's all exciting because it's all part of this grand story, and it's really fun to be able to get a front row seat to these stories.
Yeah, that's funny that you mentioned that about Colorado, because another revelation that I had on top of that mountain was that, wow, there's no water anywhere. I've never really experienced that before. But, so this podcast is really going to be built around the question, what's your story? And it seems like such a broad question, and that's because it is. It could be answered with something as simple as, well, I'm in the Coast Guard, I'm stationed in Virginia, and I'm married. It could be broad like that, just sharing who we are and what we do for a living, the title that we have. Or the answer to the question, what's your story, could go as deep as sharing an intimate testimony of where God showed up in your life, whether that be the first time or a time more recently. And so I actually really like the question being so broad, especially in military life, because when I meet new people constantly, moving and being thrown into different communities, I always genuinely start with that question, because although I'm a person who likes to go deep quick, not everybody does like that. And so that question gives people, the autonomy to take the conversation where they feel comfortable taking it. And it gives the Holy Spirit room to work as well. And no matter how deep, quote unquote, the answer, you're still going to learn something new about the person, and part of God's character and bigger plan can be revealed through the interaction. So here at Planting Roots, one of the things that we are really passionate about is just encouraging you to go and grow community. Like KG was saying, not only over social media, which is so good as well, but also where you're planted. I hope that this encourages you to go and ask that question, take it where the Holy Spirit leads. And that's a question that I'm going to ask the people who come on this podcast. I'm going to ask them, what's your story? And we're going to take it wherever God guides. And I know that He will provide everyone listening with some sort of nugget of wisdom, even if it's just a relatable story where someone can say, hey, I've been there, I know what that's like. So that's really the heart behind the question. And the phrase, so there I was, is just a clever military-related way to answer the question, what's your story?
Yeah, so just so you know, if we haven't ever meet up in person, anybody listening or watching this podcast, I've got stories. They're Steve's stories. I'd be delighted to tell them. Erin knows most of them. She's probably heard some of them multiple times, but they're great stories. They're fun stories.
And they have so many layers.
Right, and so not only do they have layers, they become fun, they become instructive, they become gentle reminders, and then they're just fascinating because, like you said, when you open the conversation with an open-ended, so what's your story, and you get, so there I was, and it's just a wild time. So we look forward to having the community at large get to dial in onto this podcast going forward. So glad, Erin, that you've taken point on it, and it's going to be exciting to see what God teaches us, shares, how He encourages us to build community through these questions of, so what's your story, or military edition, so there I was.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for being here today, KG. I'm really excited to see where God takes us. And if you have any topics or questions that you are specifically excited about hearing on this podcast, make sure you let us know in the comments down below, or go ahead and go over to the Planting Roots Instagram or website. There's multiple different avenues where you can reach us, so make sure you get those questions answered if you have them. And KG, would you mind closing us in prayer today?
I'd be delighted. So, Lord, thank you so much for being the master storyteller. We thank you that no matter what situation it is that we would start with, so there I was, you were there too. And we just thank you that you're present with us in every situation, military related or otherwise. We thank you that your story is a master story that we get to be a part of. We're one of we're the characters in the story. The plot line that develops is your handiwork, and we thank you for that. And we also thank you for the assurance that when your lamp is just giving us a next step view of what our path is, we also thank you that we can trust you to the unseen aspects, what are the unseen trials that we may have stepped over and not even realized happened. And then we also can trust you for the glorious mountaintop experience when we get to see your handiwork and see some of these story components come together, again, for your glory, but for our good as well. We ask your blessing on the podcast series. We thank you for Erin's role, and we also just pray for each one who might be listening, that each one of you would be drawn closer to God, that he would be part of your story, and that you would be able to share your story with somebody today. It's in your name we pray, Jesus, always. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, KG, and thank you everyone for listening. I hope you have an awesome day, and remember to keep looking up. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on Deeply Rooted, a podcast by Planting Roots, a ministry for military women by military women. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us on all social media platforms, or drop over to our website, www.plantingroots.net, to sign up for our Planting Roots newsletter. You don't want to miss the inspirational and practical resources developed with you in mind.